Hello and welcome to Tengy Talks TV and Movies. I'm Tengy and today we're starting the first episode of the Twilight Zone with Season 1, Episode 1, Where Is Everybody? Where Is Everybody was written by Rod Serling and directed by Robert Stevens. The plot: a man in uniform wanders on a dirt road into a small town that seems to have been very recently abandoned. Coffee is still boiling on the stove, a cigarette still burns in an ashtray. But where is everybody? Not sure who he is or where he is, he explores the town, trying to work out what is happening and where everyone has gone, growing increasingly distressed by his disturbing predicament. Points of interest in this episode: the wonderfully eerie and evocative opening title sequence with the iconic voiceover intro. I think we'd have to rate this as one of the best bits of scene setting, of tone setting, as far as any TV intros go. As soon as it starts, we're drawn right into this off-kilter world where anything might happen. It's hypnotic, unsettling, ominous, and exciting all at once. The music of the legendary Bernard Herrmann is another big part of why this sequence works so brilliantly and is so iconic. The gravitas of Serling's voiceover delivery also sells this right from its first moments. Compare this with the voiceover from The Time Element, fine in its way, but Serling's performance has a seriousness and intensity which sets this apart, establishing the tone and grounding us in the reality of the story he's presenting. The point I'm making here is that Serling's own persona, as much as his ideas and scripts, is so much a part of the intensity of the universe of the Twilight Zone. That intensity, his own intensity, is a key to what makes these fantastic stories so compelling. While not engaging with any supernatural or sci-fi concepts, this episode very much activates the horror idea of the uncanny, that deeply unsettling feeling we get when something familiar suddenly becomes unfamiliar. There's nothing strange about a small town, except when everyone in it suddenly disappears. On a more metaphorical level, this episode also touches some interesting psychological hot buttons. That feeling of being disconnected from other people, of feeling left out from something that everyone else seems to know about, of being left behind. Fears of abandonment, and at the same time the fear of being watched, a deep and nebulous sense of paranoia about one's own relationship to the rest of humanity. As with the Time Element, this story also brings in the troubling idea of not being able to tell dream from reality or being trapped in a dream. This story has an interesting reference to The Last Man on Earth. It's the title of the book that the protagonist finds in the empty store. It is also, of course, the name of the movie with a very similar theme starring Vincent Price, which was based on the novel I Am Legend by Richard Matheson, who would become one of Twilight Zone's greatest writers alongside Serling. Is this a coincidence? The novel had been released by this point under a different name, but the film had not. Or is this a Twilight Zone-like premonition of Matheson's future film adaptation and his significance to the Twilight Zone series yet to come? Who can say? The other resonance this story has is with the mystery of the Marie Celeste, the ship infamously found adrift with no one on board, with food sat on the table as if everyone had left in an inexplicable hurry, leaving no trace behind. For me, this is very much a reference point in this episode. Once again, this episode centers on a serviceman, this time an Air Force man, and once again we see the theme from the Time Element of a serviceman questioning his own sanity, his own reality. The spectre of the Cold War, of nuclear war, is also present here, as the man wonders if humanity has been destroyed by a bomb. My favourite moment in this is when the man runs into the mirror. It's so beautifully done, a moment of genuine shock and confusion, and it encapsulates this story's concern about identity, kind of shattering as it does when he collides with his own reflection. In a world without people, there is no social reflection, and our sense of ourselves, as defined by our interactions and relationships with others, is broken. This moment marks a shift in tone into something much darker and more fraught, a real descent into psychological crisis in the story. The idea of being watched yet not being seen is evoked in a really disturbing way here, as it will be in other Twilight Zone episodes. Now, spoiler alert, the ultimate revelation of what is really happening, that the man is the subject of a military psychological experiment being watched by cameras and being studied from afar, is even more disturbing than the initial setup of the abandoned town. The reason for the experiment might be benign. The man is a pilot in a simulator training for a solo moon mission on which he will be alone in space. But the way his military superiors have been sat watching detached as he lost his grip on reality and became increasingly distressed is troubling and resonant. The episode ends at the precipice of a new frontier, space exploration, and wavers unsteadily on this precipice. Can humanity do this? Should we do it? If one of us leaves the world behind, what will happen to that person? This is an unexpectedly anxious meditation on the space age. It's really a nightmare about the potential psychological effects of spaceflight. The pilot references A Christmas Carol and its ghosts, and this story seems like a haunting by the ghost of space travel future. It also asks us to consider what type of town this pilot might wander into on such a space mission. What kind of creepy world might he land in and find himself alone in? I'm more used to seeing wildly optimistic attitudes towards the space race from this period. I mean, compare this with I Dream of Jeannie's giddy optimism about astronauts and space missions. The perspective of this episode seems almost one of imploring us to consider what this goal might mean for the human at the center of it, the man in the capsule himself. It's hard not to view this as the perspective of a man, a generation traumatized and scarred by military duty, looking now to the next military frontier that servicemen might be rocketed into. With their knowledge of what the last war cost them personally, we can well understand their fears for this spaceman yet to come and the mission he is to be sent on. The enemy in this new frontier, the final voiceover tells us, is isolation. This mission is something the higher-ups want, and others want to watch, like the press are watching the experiment. But the man who takes on the mission does so alone, and he alone bears the personal cost of it. One could see the abandoned town as a place that would have been familiar to many soldiers from World War II and the more recent Korean War. They would have moved through many towns like this, devoid of people yet still filled with their belongings and signs of life abandoned. And like the protagonist, they too would have wondered, where is everybody? Who might be lurking around the next corner? And they too might have felt lost and very far from home, disconnected from everything and everyone they knew, and everything that had made them who they were in life. It's hard not to see this as another episode that is at least partially a nightmare about war, that bleeds into a sober questioning of what humanity's next great military endeavour might mean. And that question is the very kind of question that sets Twilight Zone apart from most other shows of its time, and even of our time. Plenty of great shows and movies have tackled the idea of spaceflight as an exciting idea or event, but fewer have considered at a deeper level what it might mean and what it might cost to us as people. Where this episode lands is the question, not can we travel to the moon, but should we? And let's not forget the context of this period. The space race between Russia and the US was a part of the Cold War. The military dimensions of this project extend beyond the fact that the Air Force was involved in testing rockets. It absolutely had political dimensions too, and was happening while the threat of nuclear war was simmering along under the surface of everyday life. The enemy in this new frontier might well be solitude, but in more real terms, it might also be the USSR, even though they are never mentioned. The imperative towards spaceflight at this moment was also driven by the race between the two opposing nations. This is the invisible enemy also coveting the void of space, and where some next potential conflict might even take place. As an opening episode, it starts the series off with a bang. This story is different. It tells us this series will be different. It's not afraid to leave the viewer hanging in a pretty uncomfortable space of doubt, of questioning, of uncertainty. That's what makes it so thrilling and exciting. It is unpredictable. Considered amongst other episodes, I don't know if this is quite as satisfying, and it might be purely for the fact that most of it is a monologue, albeit a very interesting one, and very well performed, but it is perhaps not quite as engaging as episodes which feature more interaction between actors. I think I had the same reaction to the Agnes Moorehead story, The Invaders. For the same reason, one person carrying the story without other characters is something I find personally a little bit less engaging than a story with more actors. But that is just a personal preference. The cast. As the sole protagonist of this story for 95% of the time, Earl Holliman gives a strong and compelling performance, and he brings intelligence and vulnerability to this role. Earl Holliman enjoyed a huge career in films which included the sci-fi classic Forbidden Planet, among many other distinguished titles. And he was also a familiar face on TV with leading roles in Policewoman, among many other notable roles. Earl Holliman is in his 90s now, long-time vegetarian and animal rights activist, and he sounds like a really cool guy. James Gregory, another of my favourite character actors, is in this. I love him best for his role in The Manchurian Candidate, but you might also know him from Beneath the Planet of the Apes, or from his fantastic TV work, which included the classic comedy Barney Miller, which I love, Star Trek, The Fugitive, so many others. He was so prolific and always great value to watch. Let me know your thoughts on Where Is Everybody down in the comments. Like and subscribe for more Twilight Zone reviews and other weird film fun. I hope I see you next time for episode 2, One for the Angels. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.